Welcome to Catchy Gaming. This is Catchy 1383. So this time around, I'm going to cover the Saints Row reboot. They were kind of forced to do a reboot after what they did in Saints Row 4, and I never played. I'm not sure if it would be technically the fifth one, but Get Out of Hell, and kind of the absurdity that they went through in terms of the series at that point. And for all intents and purposes, they painted themselves into a corner, which is kind of a shame because there were, I guess, storylines they could have definitely gone to in order to resolve specific parts of previous games, like Troy becoming the chief of police, as well as Dex becoming part of Ultor and trying to kill them. Maybe wrapping up those storylines. But they went with this over the top, more or less what I guess was originally supposed to be gangsters in space, turned into becoming the president and then going into space. So I'm trying to come up with a bit of a structure for my videos, and I still haven't quite settled on it, since a lot of the time I don't even do a script anymore because I just don't have the time. I was trying to look up elements of a game, and some of these lists are treated as separate things, but unfortunately they fail to either, learn or know that some of these things are not mutually exclusive, like conflict and story. They have them as two different elements, but they don't necessarily operate independently of each other. So, Saints Row Reboot was made by Deep Silver Volition and Fish Labs. So I guess I'm just going to stick with sort of a story gameplay and maybe a little bit of elements from visuals and sounds, which are part of gameplay, but I think they can be treated as separate. And after a little bit of internet searching, it is supposed to be the fifth game in the series. Get Out of Hell apparently does not count. Not to be confused with Saints Row 2006. This Saints Row takes place in a city called Santo Ileso. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. I've almost failed Spanish like 3 times. And the overall game feels like it's supposed to be modeled after maybe a Las Vegas-ish type of area. So one thing for sure is they definitely borrowed a great deal from Grand Theft Auto 5. I mean, I guess the previous Saints Rows kind of borrowed from Grand Theft Auto in general, but this one feels like it borrows heavily from Grand Theft Auto 5. And in some cases, at least in my opinion, to the detriment of the game. I digress. So, it's kind of similar to the first one in regards that you start out as a nobody and you move your way up to the boss. It starts you off as a member of what is essentially one of the gangs, the Marshals, who are nothing more than Stag with a new skin. So I started 2 characters, one female and one male. And I'd have to say that the dialogue feels like it was written more for the female characters, while a lot of the animations were actually made for the male characters. I'll go over that a little bit later, but I kind of want to just focus on the story. So the dialogue at first kind of felt more or less like Saints Row the Third, with a heavy slathering of sarcasm on it. It starts out with a party occurring at a church that the Saints have renovated for their use, since they're going with a religious theme. After passing through multiple scenes of the party going on in the church, you get to choose your character for the boss, and it ends with a recording of the boss telling the local gangs and Marshall to go F themselves. It does kind of a neat transition to the phone freezing and blood splattering on the phone, and your boss character being dragged into a grave and being buried giving it an element of who did it. Now, this intrigued me, and I kind of thought it would be a neat twist. Unfortunately, it doesn't turn into a neat twist. The game then transitions to several months earlier, when the boss was still working for Marshall, going after a international criminal called the Wannabe. Here you traverse through a, I guess, theme park or sort of a tourist attraction that used to be a mine, and you fight off his henchmen before you encounter him in a saloon. He tries getting away in a VTOL, which is just very similar to those of the Saints Row 3, I might add. And your character, the boss, plays fast and loose with the rules and disobeys her or his commanding officer and goes after the Wannabe. It turns into this weird sort of shooting gallery where you hang from the VTOL, shooting all the henchmen, eventually causing it to crash and arresting the Wannabe. You then end up in a locker room where your commanding officer, Gwen, hands the boss an envelope that's empty and says it's their performance bonus, even though, because of the boss, they captured the Wannabe. After exiting the building and getting into their truck, the boss then goes on a tirade. Now, here's the thing. On my second character, I had a male with a southern accent, and he didn't use a bunch of F-bombs or other profane language. He said testes. A lot. Like cow and horse testes in place of F-bombs and other four-letter words.
Motherfucking microscopic, itsy bitsy, teeny weeny, son of a bitch, bastard ass, tiny little shit sucking bit of it!
Cow balls. Goddamn cow balls and a pizzle stick between them. Horse balls. Big, giant, sweaty horse balls. Big, giant, sweaty, dangling horse testes just swinging in the goddamn breeze, knocking back and forth like a pair of motherfucking clappers in a giant horse flesh crotch belt.
I mean, I do find it kind of ironic that one of my complaints is they went a little soft in terms of some of the things they said and did in the game, and here I am sort of censoring myself, but I'm doing that because YouTube doesn't like the cussing. Anyways, there's not too many dialogue changes, and I just thought that was kind of something I wanted to note, and I wasn't really sure where to put that, so I put it there. So when the boss gets back to their apartment, you meet, I guess, the other cast of main characters. There's Eli, Kevin, and Nina. And this whole entire scene feels like some kind of weird sitcom that they were going for. And it doesn't mesh well with a whole criminal enterprise that they want to try and set up for the game. And unfortunately, every scene with these four characters, I'm going to just count the boss as a character, all play out like this. And it's very much out of place, especially with the actions of the boss. So Nina is a member of the Panteros. Kevin, more or less, is a member of the Idols. Eli is his own entity, and the boss comprises, I guess, the third element of somebody who belongs to one of the gangs. Kind of mixing it up from what they've done in the past. Anyways, in this initial meeting, they're talking about having to find creative ways to earn rent. So you go on your basically first criminal outing with your friends, and you rob a payday loan sort of business like the Money Tree. So one thing I wanted to cover is that they wouldn't let Eli have a gun because he accidentally shot one of them. Now there's a point to me making that observation. I'll go over it later. But antics ensue, and the boss ends up in a fight with other gang members and then running from the police as a result. almost being captured but being saved by Nina. And before I forget, there was one initial part where you're driving to the business that you're going to rob that Eli starts playing his motivational speaker, whatever, tape, CD, radio, doesn't matter. And it's has a line that says, "Be your own boss." And it kind of influences what you think it does on a very obvious scale, which is kind of the problem, and not what I thought it would eventually lead to. Anyways, after this robbery, the boss says they'll go back to their sort of former ways of earning some money, which unlocks various activities and not really relevant to the story. They actually have almost no bearing to the story whatsoever. But let me cover the other gangs so far. The Panteros are more or less the Brotherhood mixed with the Carnales. And I really hope I pronounced that one too. I'm not entirely sure. Anyways, they're big, beefy, and they drive big, beefy trucks. A lot of pickups and some with some big guns on them, including monster trucks. Then there are the Idols. They're supposed to be anarchists that have somehow managed to gain an incredible amount of influence amongst people and are obsessed with social media and spreading themselves on the internet as much as possible. They kind of actually feel like they're just a new version of the Deckers, maybe with a touch of the Rollers mixed in there. And then there's Marshall. They're technically not a gang, but functionally they are. And they're just stag. I mean, a lot of their vehicles, other than some minor changes, literally are the exact same vehicle. Even their VTOL, yes, they don't have the inverted wing, but I can show you here that I'm pretty sure Saints Row 3 VTOL and the one in Saints Row Reboot are pretty much the same thing. Anyways, after a series of missions in which the boss gets fired from Marshall, followed by another, mission where both Nina and Kevin have a falling out with their respective gangs, they decide to form their own criminal organization based off of Eli's motivational speaker, with the whole theme of being your own boss. Exactly where you thought it would lead to when you first heard it. So this leads them to finding a location for their new organization, which leads them to a broken down church, in which then they find the property owner who owns a bunch of other properties, and then they take him for a ride to scare him into giving them the deed for the church. Never mind, even if you did give up the deeds, they would have more than enough legal recourse to get that back, but I guess that's not how the law works in this game. So, when you approach the church, like that old church, that one on 3rd Street, basically going back to the first game with an homage to the 3rd Street Saints, also based out of a church. They unfortunately fall into a similar trap that I've seen with, let's say, prequels, for example, and how characters or objects or places get their name. So they go to the church, they find the sigil on the ground that they decide to go with, which is the fleur-de-lis. And then they're staring at a statue and they're like, we're going to be called the Saints. Kind of rings similar in that term of how things play out in prequels. Kind of similar how Han Solo got his last name. If you ever saw the Solo movie, it comes off as kind of dumb. This wasn't nearly as dumb as that, but it was still kind of dumb. And speaking of sort of dumb plot points, how they acquired the property was not, well thought out in my opinion. So they basically kidnapped the guy who owned the church, and then you do multiple sort of stunts in a car to scare him, which is just kind of dumb. I mean, you're supposed to be starting a criminal enterprise, and the criminal part that you do is doing stunts to scare a guy instead of doing something that, maybe life-threatening. I mean, in a way, yes, I would say it is, but since they're also in the vehicle, I wouldn't consider it. And then there's the legal aspect of it, him being coerced into giving up the land deeds for the property. I'm not sure how property ownership works in this game, but I'm pretty sure you wouldn't be able to just take the deeds. So from here, you start building your criminal enterprise, starting with gym rob. And from there, you build your basic, I guess, they call it a criminal empire. It's more like organization. And I'll get into detail about that later, since I'm considering more of gameplay than story, even though it is tied to some parts of the story. From this point, you have a series of missions that you go on, and most of them are tied to your friends/roommates in the game. Here, I thought they were going to build motivations for maybe why one of them, or all three of them, potentially betrayed the boss. But that didn't happen. I guess they were going for more of a bonding experience with these missions. And I thought Eli's in particular were kind of set up for him being the person who tried to murder the boss. The very first mission you do is teaching him how to use a gun properly. Something they covered at the beginning of the game that he could not, and he accidentally shot one of them. On top of that, his obsession with the motivational speaker of being your own boss. How can he be his own boss if the boss is the boss? Kind of giving him motivation to off the boss and become the boss. Also on top of that, you do a series of, I guess, LARPing missions with him, where they sort of make fun of post-apocalyptic / medieval chivalry kind of gameplay called the Dust Moot. And they programmed a whole bunch of special animations and other little bits of things for this whole entire scenario. Anyways, the boss ends up making the game the boss's game, totally usurping Eli, even though Eli seems to be going with it. But the boss takes over, names the house after, like, why don't we just make our own house? Becomes the ruler of the LARPing world instead of Eli. And eventually it does involve the other two roommates, and I guess sort of, I don't know, deepening their bond, doing this whole entire thing together. But I'd also have to say, I guess this kind of on a tangent, that this whole entire scenario is just way out of place. It makes no sense for a criminal organization to engage in such an activity on such a level. They're supposed to be criminals, and they're LARPing with Nerf guns. So that was my take on Eli. When it comes to Nina, I sort of thought it had to do more with a scenario in which she has that yellow car, and she has a very special bond with it. And when it gets destroyed, because she sided with the boss and left the gang, essentially, or, pitted herself against the gang, I thought she may have blamed the boss and maybe given her motivation in some sort to kill the boss in that regards. Kevin's motivations are kind of weak. Mainly, I guess, probably say along the same lines of Nina, having to leave his gang that he was affiliated with in favor of the boss. But not much was going on with him, so I ruled him out pretty early as any possible suspect, due to not really seeing any possible motivation for him to do so. I could think of one, which, in order to get in the good graces of the idols, he would have to kill the boss and maybe even become part of the collective. But that's a bit of a stretch considering Kevin's personality from what I've seen, and what they try to do to him later in the game. So Nina's storyline leads you to the storyline where you destroy the Panteros' sort of headquarters. They call it the Forge, where they make a lot of their vehicles in a old car manufacturing plant. So this leads to them meeting up playing a board game. Remember, they're supposed to be criminals and they're playing board games with each other. I don't know. Like I said, a lot of this is like really out of place. At least when it comes to your interactions and things you do with your roommates. Or I should say the roommate characters. So you come up with the idea to rob a train guarded by Marshall to steal money from them so you can give money or pay gang members or people to join your gang. In order to ensure that they can rob the train, they get more muscle, which leads the boss to breaking out the Wanali out of the Marshall prison in the game. So here I'm going to give a spoiler warning for anyone who actually cares. I am going to spoil the story. Sorry, but that's what's going to happen. At first, I thought this was just going to be a red herring, that Wanali was there to distract you from who possibly actually murdered the boss. And I guess I just spoiled it with that last sentence. Sorry, spoilers, but I don't think anyone really cares. But the Wanali is the one who betrays the boss, and it's super obvious after a little bit. The motivations are really weak, but let me go over a few things before I cover why he decided to betray the boss. So, in order to, I guess, build trust and a working relationship between the boss and the Wanali and the other three roommate characters, I should say, they go on a sort of business retreat where they're supposed to be doing fun things with each other. Another mission and idea that just seems way out of place. I mean, they do involve combat in the mission, but it just comes way out of left field, and I don't know why they decided to roll with this sort of scenario. Which leads me to a bit of a problem I have with a lot of the storyline missions that they have. They establish an issue, and in the very next mission, it's just over. You solve it within one mission. There's no build up to it, no planning, nothing like that whatsoever. You just do it, and then the next thing you do, you're done. So that whole entire mission you did with the Wanali to build, trust and work on your interpersonal skills with this character, you just move on to robbing the train. And the worst part about robbing this train is that the Panteros still were able to put vehicles together to also try and rob it while you rob the train. This is where the problem is. Sergio, I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that relatively okay, the leader of the Panteros, is on a helicopter and jumps down onto the train. You're like, oh boy, boss fight on a train, kind of like Gears of War scenario. But nope. Out of nowhere, and in a cutscene, the Wanali comes in and kills Sergio with no fanfare whatsoever. First, I thought it was possibly faking it because he was supposed to be working with him initially. But nope, he just died. They didn't show him being stabbed. For whatever reason, they decided to more or less censor it, even though you've been shooting people, stabbing them, and all that other fun stuff. But they censored him being stabbed by the Wanali. I mean, he turns around and wipes blood on his shirt, but that's all you see. You don't even see the blade go into him, so that's why I thought it was kind of fake. And I might add, this is a video game design sin, killing the boss in a cutscene. It reminded me of the beginning of Halo 5, where you kill the Hand of the Prophet in a cutscene. And that's just lame. Anyways, after this train scene, and then they go back to the church where they have a money fight, and Eli almost kills somebody with a gold brick. And they somehow manage to get enough money out of 2 duffel bags. And the Wanali gets a brick of gold for his trouble. Even though in the cutscene that they showed, there were tons of duffel bags full of money all over the place. Why they only took 2 or showed 2 is beyond me. From here, you continue setting up your criminal enterprise, buying businesses as you go, and doing whatever you need to do to get up and running. You can also see that the church is going through some renovations, getting all the clutter and stuff cleaned up. So this eventually leads to a lawyer showing up at the church saying that Marshall's Industries owns the Saints. And this is due to the boss sign a non-competitive agreement, which apparently she broke by robbing the train. Now, let's stop and think about this just for a brief second here. I don't know how you can own a criminal operation. You could probably own their assets. Fine, whatever. But if they were smart, they would have never registered that under the boss's name in any shape or form, so they wouldn't have been able to take them, and non-competitive agreements don't work that way. It would have been a civil matter between the boss and Marshall. They wouldn't just be able to own anything that they started or owned like that. And it just seemed like a really poorly thought out plot point to this whole entire scenario. I mean, the only funny part that was even amusing or even was when the boss pulled out a gun and shot the lawyer, which you saw from a mile away. That's what was going to happen to this guy. So this prompts the boss to send all the saints and along with her roommates to go after Atticus themselves, resulting in them raiding a building that looks like a boot. I guess it's supposed to be their headquarters. When you get to the top, you meet a woman that you met earlier in the game that is just like a side character, not really worth mentioning. And she says she can get the saints back to the boss, even though I don't think that's ever a thing of them ever being taken away, but whatever. But she has to get Atticus off the board, and they come up with a plan, which the very next mission is executing that plan and it working, which again, it sort of emphasizes my problem with how they kind of tell the story and handle conflict. It just starts with one thing and the very next moment it ends in the next mission, usually going over the course of 2 missions. The only exception to that maybe would be getting the Hummingbird Codex back from the idols. Anyways, with the mission where you humiliate Atticus and get the board taken away from him, or I should say his business taken away from him, you are the tiebreaker in a vote. And there are 2 options they actually give you. You can kill Atticus or tell him he's fired. I don't know if there's a moot point to that. And what I mean by that is that you can choose one, and I'm not sure if Atticus would still be killed or if he gets to walk away and he'd be in the story later on, or if it's going to be some weird plot point for the next game, assuming that they actually, get that far. I'm doubting they will. I did start a second character, but I'm kind of waiting to see if they will fix the game so that certain things track correctly, so I can actually earn the achievements, which was something I wanted to do before I put out this review, but I couldn't. I'll touch on that later. But anyways, I shot him in my first gameplay, and I think I'll spare him in the second one to see if there's any real difference. So after that whole entire scenario is done, you go to the church and you have the party where the game starts out with the boss being dragged to a grave. I don't know how, but they go from inside to just standing outside as if they're going to go join the party. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And the one ollie comes up, and the boss is like, oh yeah, come on in. And the one ollie takes the knife that was given to him by the boss and stabs the boss. And the one ollie's explanation is that he wanted companionship, and that he found the companionship of Elijah and the other roommates to be compelling, and that in order to earn that or get that companionship, he had to replace the boss, and that's why he stabbed the boss. It wasn't for anything like, let's say, power over the organization. So after the boss is buried, you go through a dream sequence. It's not really noteworthy, and it kind of doesn't, I don't know how to put it. It's kind of pointless, actually. They're like, oh no, there's a snake amongst us, and it's the one ollie, and you brought him in. And it's like, yeah, we know this. This isn't some revelation. What's the point of this whole entire thing? And somehow the boss climbs out of the grave, which I'm not going to bash in any sort of way. After all, in the very first Saints Row, you get blown up on a boat, and then your character in the second one is the same character, but survived it somehow. So they go through this whole entire scenario of the boss going to a safe house that the one ollie led them to, finding out that the one ollie took the boss's friends, and then going back to, I guess it's Silver Nugget Gulch or something like that, where the game started out as the boss playing as Marshall, fighting a bunch of the one ollie thugs again. Eventually leading to only one being left and putting the address of where the one ollie is into the boss's phone, leading to another sort of kind of issue with the game plot, in that the VTOL that crashed at the beginning of the game is still somehow physically functional and has yet to be removed, and that all the Marshall items are biometrically locked, but somehow still have the boss's data in there, and the boss is able to use all these weapons, which, is kind of a glaring plot hole. Because remember, the one ollie jumped onto the VTOL at the beginning of the game. I guess you can make the argument that the plane was already running, but I still kind of have an issue with it. Along with all the vehicles and guns you steal from Marshall. So you use the VTOL and you go to a abandoned building in the middle of what I guess is their sort of casino area of the city. And after killing everything outside, the boss goes inside, which leads to one of the better cutscenes in the game. That being when the boss ambushes the Wenali and starts fighting him. The cat cage gets knocked over and Snickerdoodle jumps on the Wenali and claws the shit out of his face. Best cutscene in the game. I may be biased, but that's just my opinion. So then each of the friends start helping each other out and wooing the Wenali, eventually causing him to run away, with more of his thugs showing up to back him up. Although I might add that when Kevin nailed him in the face with a waffle iron, I probably would have just made it an end right there. But that would have been bad, because that would have violated the rule of killing a boss in a cutscene. So unlike Sergio, or however you pronounce his name, I don't really care, you actually fight the Wenali, chasing him around the building, shooting him along with killing his thugs. This leads the boss up to, I guess, what is the saucer section of this building, and the Wenali being in a tornado firing at the boss. You can pick up an anti-tank rocket here. Don't recommend it. It kind of sucks. I would just stick with the RPG if you have it. So you have to shoot the Wenali down in order to progress through this part of the game. And I guess you could say this is a second boss phase when you fight the Wenali and the tornado, because you down his health the first time when you're chasing him throughout the whole entire hotel/casino. And then you get to the top and the Wenali is injured and you sort of do a standoff where you draw, and it's just a quick time event, sort of reminiscent of what they did in Saints Row 3 and 4. Thankfully, it's only one button trigger, and you shoot the Wenali. So I did this twice. First time I wasn't recording, the second time I was, to see if it would happen again, but this cutscene bugged out horrifically, and I'll just put the clip in right here for you guys to watch. Anyways, after that whole entire scene ends, because I'm pretty sure it's in-game, it jumps to a cutscene where the boss shoots him in the head and then makes sure the job's done by shooting him multiple times. Ending with the roommates coming up to the top of the roof watching the sunset along with Snickerdoodle. There's one last little bit of territory you can use. You can build the Saints Tower, yet again something reminiscent from Saints Row 3. Or the third, whatever you want to call it. And it ends in another note, which I don't remember if they did this in Saints Row 3, but I know they did it in Saints Row 4, in which all the characters sing and dance along to some licensed music. I skipped over that part, mainly because I don't think I could show it here, but it was just kind of like really out of place. Again, one of those things they probably should not have added to the game, but they did. And it kind of felt like they did it because they did it in Saints Row 4. So the story is not that great, and there's much left to be desired in terms of it. Even Saint Rose 3, was far better than what this was. And to be honest, they would have been far better off if they continued down the line of something, let's say, what happened in Saints Row 2. And maybe, just maybe, moving on from Saints Row 4 by pretending that it never existed and making a plot that continued the storyline from Saints Row 3 that didn't involve the Saints being movie stars. In that case, I'd probably say going back to Saints Row 2 and skipping Saints Row 3 altogether. Wasn't a bad game, but the whole becoming famous thing kind of is what netted them in this situation to begin with. But if it was me, I definitely would have sort of ignored Saints Row 4 and just continue the storyline from there. and try to maybe tone back the quirkiness that is just oozing from this storyline, voice acting, gameplay, and everything else. And maybe tone that down to something like what they had in Saints Row 2. So with that said, let me address what I mean by quirkiness. It's pretty much there from the very first part of the game. And I guess I'll just go over voice acting and the dialogue in the game at this point too, since it's more or less tied in with the storyline. So it starts out with a video that turns out to be an orientation video for Marshall, with it being very reminiscent of one of the introductory videos of Stag from Saints Row the Third. Then it introduces Gwen, and they have a bit of back and forth banter to each other. And at first, it wasn't too bad. It was kind of like Saints Row 3, which wasn't the worst by far. It then sort of, I don't know how to put this, devolves into this weird quirkiness after you capture the Wenali. And there were signs of it there when you were playing throughout the whole entire section. Like your character keeps saying, "It's my first fucking day," and repeats it multiple times as if it's some kind of joke, and it's supposed to be, but it's not funny.
Jesus Christ, it's my first fucking day!
But then on your drive back to your apartment, your character starts cussing. The female character, the one I made first, was just dropping a whole bunch of F-bombs and shit, and F-bombs again, with more cursing, mainly going back and forth between shit and fuck. Now, the male character I made chose a southern accent, because I didn't like how the male character sounded for the equivalent of the female character. And he said horse testes, then cow testes. I'm pretty sure he said cow. It might have been bull, but I'm pretty sure he said cow.
Cow balls. Goddamn cow balls and a pizzle stick between them. Horse balls. Big, giant, sweaty horse balls.
And he just said testes a lot until you make it back to the apartment. Then the whole entire scene turns into this weird sort of, I don't know, sitcom, including how all the lines are delivered and what they're doing. I mean, the boss comes into the door and hangs their gun up on the coat rack. And then they talk about casual things like, how are we going to pay rent? Oh no, we'll just have to get creative. Followed by Kevin saying that he's going to put on a dinner and a show because he's not wearing a shirt. You know, you almost half expect to have a laugh box going off going, ha 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 ha. Like all the scenes that involve the roommates, when they're all together at least, play out like this. And it feels like this is not how criminals would talk and or act. And I'm kind of basing this off of Saints Row 2, more or less. A little bit of Saints Row 3, which did have the similar levels of quirkiness, but not nearly as much as this one did. I mean, on a technical side, the delivery is good. It's just the writing for what they said and how they act is not. The use of cuss words feels like it's being used as a crutch, not so much because it makes sense to be using them in particular situations. Yes, there are points in the game where I would think that cussing is appropriate. And don't get me wrong, cussing is no stranger to Saints Row series in general, and particularly with, say, Saints Row 2 and 3, where they probably had situations where they weren't really all that necessary, but at least conveyed some sort of frustration with the situation. So, future me that's editing this video, hello. The dialogues also from the previous Saints Row is a reflection of the over-exaggerated personalities and the sort of weird romanticization of being in a gang versus whatever this is supposed to be in Saints Row Reboot. Let me play a clip from a cutscene in Saints Row 2 and why it was a better game in terms of its dialogue.
So, what you think?
It's kind of a shithole.
True that. But it's a shithole with potential.
I don't know, man.
Oh, come on. A stripper pole, some flat screens, maybe some nicer furniture.
You had me at stripper pole.
Fucking A.
It's not just its delivery of the lines itself. There is a little bit of silliness to it, but it's also the absurdity and kind of the inappropriateness of it, which is very much lacking in the reboot, when the most inappropriate thing they can come up with was just a bunch of cussing. So the sad thing is, I was playing Saints Row 4, mainly because a YouTuber that I like to watch said that the game was like Saints Row 3. I would say it's more like Saints Row 4 re-elected. I'm pretty sure I stated that earlier, but I'm going to state it again. And when I get to the gameplay portion of my review, I'll definitely point some things out that I noticed. But getting back to my point, that there's audio logs in the game, and there's more depth to these audio logs than the whole entire story of the Saints Row reboot. Not all of them, but specific ones, like Julius's. Not only is Keith David doing double duty, but it's pretty well done. But the point is that Julius realizes that he unleashed a complete and total psychopath onto the city, and that he totally regrets doing so, and that he took it upon himself to stop the boss, or at least attempt to. For me, this story was just a big disappointment, which is far worse than just being bad. And it's not like I had high expectations for the game. I just thought they would do something better than Saints Row 4. And I'm kind of guessing, based from the little bit I played of Gat Out of Hell, probably better than that. And unfortunately, the series is kind of heading towards a place of apathy. At least it is with me. And I'm kind of under the impression that that's also happening with other people. And that's more or less a nail in the coffin for a series. So I'll end part 1 here, and I'll start part 2 soon. I never intended to go in this much detail, I just did. But I'm going to cover the gameplay next time, and that is a whole can of worms. If you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching and have a good one.